Welcome, everybody. My name is Alexander Kay. I hold the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Chair in Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. I'm also the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis. I want to welcome everyone in the room and everybody who is watching online to this discussion, which is being co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. We're especially grateful to the staff of those two centers and also to MTS, Brandeis's Media Technology Services, for pulling together this actually very complicated event in a very, very short period of time. They worked very hard and we are grateful. This is a very unusual panel. Over the past few days, we've all witnessed events that are almost impossible to even speak about, let alone make sense of intellectually, and the events are still unfolding. By the minute, we are learning more and more about the unprecedented magnitude and cruelty of the attacks on Israel. And we are also learning more and more about the intensifying violence on Israel's borders with Lebanon and Syria, the continuation of Hamas's bombardment of Israeli population centers, and more about the unfolding conflict inside Gaza and the suffering of people there, including the suffering of the very many people there who in no way support the leadership of Hamas. So we cannot reach for our customary scholarly distance from these events, and nor should we. Many of us are directly, personally affected by these events. Many of you have probably heard of the cruel murder of the daughter and son-in-law of our colleague, Professor Ilan Troen, who was also the founding director of the Schusterman Center, and there are an unimaginable number of similar, appalling, unspeakable stories. As a result, I mean, I'll speak for myself, but I imagine this is a sentiment shared by others behind this table. We are overwhelmed and we are very emotional. And that is why I'm doubly grateful to all our panelists for being here on such short notice in these very difficult circumstances. But despite the emotions and the overwhelm, and perhaps even because of those things, we also feel a responsibility to begin to analyze what is going on from the perspective of our own experiences and expertise. Many of our students and many beyond the Brandeis campus have many questions about these complicated events and are looking for some kind of framework through which to begin to understand what has happened and what will happen. For another thing, while a strong emotional response to what we are witnessing is inevitable, we also need guidance on how to think in these circumstances so that we, and perhaps more importantly, those who are making decisions on a geopolitical level, can act with wisdom, with an eye to a goal of a long-term and sustainable, better future. So here's how this conversation will work. We want to focus on an opportunity to hear questions from our students in the room, and if there is time, also from those online. So we'll begin with some brief comments from our panelists, whom I will introduce as they speak, and I'm going to make the introductions very brief to make sure we have more time for conversation. And then we'll use the bulk of our time to respond to questions from you in the room and online. For those in the room, I want you to also know that at the end of the kind of formal panel, our panelists have graciously agreed to stay behind for 30 minutes or more to meet in a more informal way with anyone who wants to talk to them. So let me turn first to Professor Bellin, who's the Myra and Robert Kraft Professor of Arab Politics in the Department of Politics and the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis. Professor Bellin, let's start with Hamas. So what is the relationship between Hamas, the Palestinian people, the international community? They seem on the one hand to be a state-like organization. This was an extremely well-coordinated, multi-pronged attack. On the other hand, they are supported by a fraction, in fact, of Palestinians, or their leadership is, And the press is always talking about Hamas fighters as militants rather than an army or anything like that. Can you help us begin to understand that?
So the Palestinian people's relationship to Hamas is really mixed. Hamas was elected into office by a majority of Gazans in 2006. At that time, Hamas campaigned as an alternative to the corruption and poor governance that had been exhibited by the Palestine Authority. Hamas did not campaign in 2006 on its commitment to creating a theocratic state in the entire land of Israel. It's 17 years since those elections. There have been no elections in the West Bank or Gaza since. Hamas has retained its hold onto power through repression and corruption. And it has proven as guilty of poor governance as the Palestine Authority was before it. So the big question is, does Hamas enjoy popular support inside Gaza today? And the answer is quite mixed. There was a public opinion poll that was carried out by the Washington Institute just this past July. And here's what they found. A slight majority of Gazans, 57%, have a somewhat positive opinion of Hamas. At the same time, 70% of Gazans say they would prefer to see Hamas step down and would prefer to see administrators from the Palestine Authority take over governance in Gaza. But at the same time, the poll found that 62% of Gazans endorsed a continued ceasefire with Israel, but only 50% agreed that Hamas should stop calling for Israel's destruction and or accept a two-state solution. So it's a very mixed picture. And what this suggests is that there is not necessarily broad popular opposition to the removal of Hamas by force, but don't expect a majority of Gazans to disavow Hamas completely. Hamas has a very strong presence as a social movement in Gaza, besides just being the governor of the region. And it manages a whole host of charities and schools and mosques, so it has a robust base of support there. So the question is, do these facts put the finger on the scale in support of Israel's plan to remove Hamas leadership by force? You know, will the population support that? And I am doubtful. We all know that the process of removing Hamas by force will be extraordinarily costly in terms of both civilian casualties and Israeli military casualties. We're talking about very intense urban guerrilla warfare, which makes it very complicated and costly, and more complicated and costly because you have very high density of population in Gaza, and because you have this very huge network of underground tunnels throughout Gaza that will permit Hamas fighters to pop up suddenly all over the territory and ambush Israeli soldiers. So would Israel be able to sustain the level of casualties, both civilian and military, to fully unseat Hamas? I'm pretty skeptical about that. As far as outside powers go, specifically in the Arab world, there's little love lost between Hamas and the major Arab states such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. All of them see Hamas as a radical terrorist movement. They'd be very happy to see Hamas go. And even Qatar, which has been a major benefactor of Hamas, it too has retreated in recent months in financial support of the Hamas government. It has been put up by Hamas's overtures to radical Islamist movements in Syria. So you might imagine these different countries might come together. Let's say there is this invasion and there is massacre, and somehow Hamas leadership really takes a very bad blow, is vanquished militarily. Would these powers come together to negotiate some sort of replacement of Hamas? Well, maybe, but again, I see this as very problematic in two ways. First, again, the cost of Hamas removal is so very high. I don't think the costs will be manageable politically by Israel. And second, I'll conclude there's no obvious cohort of Palestinian leadership waiting in the wings to take over should Hamas be unseated that would be in a place to really lead Gaza in a new direction. So if there were such a group waiting in the wings, I might be more optimistic. People would fall in line, but I don't see that.
Thank you, Professor Bellin. I turn now to Professor Yuval Evri, who's the Marash and Ocuin Chair in Ottoman, Mizrahi, and Sephardic Studies here at Brandeis. Professor Evri, you grew up in the area that bore the brunt of these attacks over the weekend. Could you help us understand, first of all, something about the context of that particular area? And also help us understand the response of Israelis in this particular moment. We're hearing a lot in the American media of sort of Israeli spokesmen talking about the need to crush, obliterate Hamas. Is that the overwhelming sentiment among Israeli people, or are there other voices as well?
Okay, thank you, Alex. First of all, I want to start and say that it's really hard to find words in this kind of days. For me personally, it's not only that we have, experienced an event that never happened before. I think that
What is your voice of it?
So yeah, but the words itself, yeah, it's really hard to find the right words to use to describe what's happening now, every minute, and what happened on Saturday. It's not only a question of translation that, most of the events happened, and people that are speaking about it are speaking either Hebrew or Arabic, but it's also, the fact that we really don't really know exactly the scale of what happened. And I will say that, yes, that I was born and raised in Beersheba. Most of my family now, I have a large family, live in Beersheba, in the Gaza envelope, in the Otef Aza, in Ashkelon, and they are, suffering this situation for a long time. But definitely this event is affecting them even strongly. So for me, it's very emotional time, and it's part of this kind of process. So I'm sorry if I won't have really precise word to describe everything and give some answers. I think that what I wanted to bring is first, to say that these events that happen, the attacks, the atrocities, the massacre, the numbers of casualties in one day never happened in the history of the conflict in one day. This kind of event is something that is still shocking in its, to understand, and it's definitely changing many of the things. But it's even in this moment of thinking that this is something that never happened before, I think it's very important to put it in historical context, because there is historical context. It's not something that happened completely out of it's definitely something else. It's definitely something that has never happened in this, this kind of atrocities and pictures and stories that we hear never happened before, but it's part of a history of this place. One of the contexts that I want to bring is first the context of the periphery. Most of the people that live in the areas near the border with Gaza are people that live for many years in feeling that they are part of, they are neglected, they are marginalized, they are overlooked. There were different kind of other cycles that I'm going to talk about, violent cycles, and they think that if it will happen the same in other parts of Israel, Tel Aviv, it will be a different kind of result. They feel that they are neglected not only in terms of security, but also in terms of infrastructure, of education, of work, of housing. For them, they feel that they're kind of second Israel. Yeah, that for them, Israel doesn't look at them the same. And the fact that in the events themselves on Saturday, some of the places were under control of militants for more than 8 hours, 10 hours. The distance that they took the army to come, or the police force to come, and people who called their families now with social media. People knew from second one what happened, and it took so long, it even intensified this kind of a feeling. So this is very important to put it in this context. And if they have now a feeling of they want to really a promise of a solution that will like a magic solution of dismantling Hamas and so on that the generals are talking about, this is the sentiment that is coming from. Even though I will talk about it in a minute, I agree with Professor Bellin that this is not something that is really tenable to happen. The second historical context that I want to bring, that this area since 2007 and the Hamas coming to power, the blockade that the Gaza Strip is being under, this area is being ongoing of rocket attacks and violence and wars that happening, sometimes getting to a peak in 2009. There was a big cycle in 2014, the last one in May 2021. Each time there was the same kind of promises by the generals that they're going to crash, they're going to dismantle, they're going to take over, but nothing happened. And this building up in the side that near the border, but also in Gaza Strip, that is under, since 2007, a really dire situation. Every cycle of violence, hundreds of people, thousands of people have been killed, destruction. This, we see that this every time only intensify the next cycle, and we saw what happened today, on Saturday, and what's happening now. So we need to bring this history. And I think it's very, very important to listen to it. And now in Israel, if you listen to the news in Israel, the generals are back in full force, and all of them are talking only in one voice. There's no other voice coming, or barely other voice. And all the voices are talking about winning. I don't know what's means in this time. And everybody's talking about crushing, לרסק, לנתץ, לשטח, dismantling, the flattening, all these kind of words that nobody, when you ask him another question, nobody, of course, give any details what it means when you do it. And there is no other voices present. I think if we are here as scholars, as people that, activists, people that care about the area of Israel, Palestine, need to think is to bring about other possibilities into the discussion. What is the other possibilities? You have now more than 150 people hostages. What's happening with hostages? Nobody's talking about it. How come we don't already having pressure to talk about it? What is the prospect of what's happening in Gaza every day when you see buildings are crushed and people are dying, and we see the photos, and we know that most of the Hamas leaders are in the underground city and not affected by it. So this is helping us. What is the reason to do it? So many questions are coming up. I will stop here and we'll continue later. But I think it's very important to put it in this context and to understand when, first of all, that the Israeli sentiment of revenge or collective punishment is coming from this history. But it doesn't mean that this is the thing that needs to be happen. And we need always to think about Gaza and the Gazan people, 2.4 million people that live really 7 kilometers away, and think that we need to live in the future together. And this is something that we need to find a solution to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Evri. I'm turning out to my left. The two people to my immediate left are Professor Shai Feldman, who's the Raymond Frankel Professor of Israeli Politics and Society at Brandeis, and Professor Abdel Monem Saeed Ali, who is the Chairman, CEO, and Director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo, and is also the Chairman of the Egyptian daily newspaper Al-Masry Al-Youm, and the founding Senior Fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies here at Brandeis. These two scholars, together with their colleague Dr. Khalil Shikaki, wrote really the best book on the Arab-Israeli conflict from the perspective of international relations and political science. Especially, I recommend everyone that book, Arabs and Israelis. The second edition just came out. For context, it's really indispensable. Professor Feldman actually sort of volunteered to not have an opening comment just now in order to leave more room for questions from the floor. And that's a very gracious thing for him to do. So let me please turn now to Dr. Saeed Ali. Can you help us understand, please, how are Egyptians and the Arab world more generally thinking about this situation? Again, this is something that's not often emphasized in the press, but the Gaza Strip does not only share a border with Israel, it of course also shares a border with Egypt.
Well, I barely can express myself. Not the Arab world, not Egypt. I'm just an individual, happen to be 75 years old. And in 50 years of them, I have been with these conflicts. If I learned in anything, and from the war that I participated in, that it was in 1973, is war is a very, very horrifying thing. I mean, to be in war and see not only the images on the screen, but rightly the blood, all the internals of people coming out, they're vomiting. Even when you try to save them and carry them, they are so heavy, human beings for some. Wars get the beast out of us. And I would like to start by offering my condolences for the people here who are affected directly, because I know what does it mean to lose a son. So here I will say we are here damned between two possibilities. One possibility that we keep the inferno going, inferno that a fire that feeds itself. And we studied this, we made the book. Our work in life was dedicated to that conflict. And even when we teach it, we try to tell our students how much anger, hate, a lot of things, sense of victimhood that's happening. That's very deep. I mean, the least you can say from the Israeli side, the Holocaust. And from the Palestinian side, it is the Nakba. You know, what happened of 70 years of being on the wrong side of statehood. So we have this built in the situation without doubt. It made the crimes that Hamas did, and now the flattening and the issues that my colleague here referred to, the feeling, and you took it to the open that you want to make revenge. That it's this built-in is threatened of having an expansion of the conflagration that we have. I mean, there is a great possibility that the West Bank will not stay a while their fellow Palestinians in Gaza are being flattened or seeing the scenes again. The social media, television, and all that create a lot of buildup of anger and hate. The same Hezbollah, the same Syria. So here, the war might expand. And then we will have a lot of, I was lucky that the war I fought in, it was soldier to soldier. And the purpose of it was to make peace, and we made peace. But this one can just add to the pains and the destruction that's happening. And just a direct answer to Alex's question, why I thank him for bringing me here. You know, Egyptians are very bewildered and in the Arab world. I mean, initially, it was just a Palestinian response like the Intifada, like any action the Palestinians are doing to respond to a long time of feeling that they have been damaged in many ways. However, the next day, they saw the images that you see. I can give an example. Azhar, which is a religious institution very important in Egypt, it has a declaration in the first day immediately that's supporting the Palestinians. By the next day, she made, a very, very strong statement against any action against civilian people, touching children, women, and the likes. So we have this kind of action and reaction and dualities as the developments is taking place. Also, it's happening in Egypt, and I think also in Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, that we might have another wave of terror in the region. I mean, here I will come to one of the major contradictions that we have in the region between the power of extremism and religion. I will say, as much as religions are good for us in different ways, and the power of states, civilians, people who think that life worth something. That's a very generalization. At the end, it comes into politics in terms of states, leaders, and stuff like this. What the Egyptians, Saudis, Emiratis, even the Qataris are trying to do, how do you find a way out? And it would come, in that mix of denouncing and saluting and condolences. I mean, all that mix of decisions. I see here that is the main battle that needs to be won. And it can be won if only we asked ourselves, when we in the past succeeded, we succeeded in the series of peace treaties between Egypt and Israel, Jordan and Israel, between the other Abrahamite group of agreements. That's because people decided, A, not to allow extremism to have a veto over their national decision. And in Egypt, the country is trying to, walk very carefully in order to rebuild itself after years of conflict. Is really the last thing we want to add another war to the Ukrainian war, who has nothing to do with it, yet we have been affected very much deeply and negatively. So here I will say the way out here is to understand the source and who are providing it with the most kinds of energy to, I think Iran is a very important actor in this one. Because the big move towards peace was not used rightly, neither by Israel nor the United States. Because it was not used, time here is a factor, and allowed the anti-peace people really to realize how much the geopolitics of the region will be changing if this happened between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So I believe that, I know now I'm taking more than I deserve of time, but I will say, let us make from the good thing capable of fighting with the bad things. Shukran. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saeed Ali. I turn now to Professor Jonathan Sarna, University Professor, and Joseph H. and Belle Braun Professor of American Jewish History. We're all sitting here in the United States. And Professor Sarna is the expert on American Jewry. Of course, not all of the victims of these attacks were Jews. There were many non-Jews that were killed and injured, and we know of at least one Palestinian man who appears to have been taken as a hostage into Gaza. But the overwhelming bulk of the deaths and injuries, and indeed the target of them, were Jews. So this is not only an Israeli moment, but it's also a tragic moment, perhaps the blackest day in Jewish history, with the exception of the Shoah, for certainly many centuries. Professor Sarna, can you help us think about that?
Think about it all day and night. It's hard to remember that just 1 week ago, we had a sense American Jews are divided among themselves. There's what they call distancing between American Jewry and Israel. The high holidays witness sermons by very powerful and important American rabbis, which were deeply critical of the Israeli government. And many people wondered what would be the long-term impact. And yet, a week later, it seems like a century ago that this was on our mind. I have been impressed at the wall-to-wall unity that we have seen, with a few exceptions, in the American Jewish community. I suppose we saw it in the Berlin chapel on Monday, where you saw a full spectrum of students. People saw it downtown in Boston. And we've seen it across the country, where organizations that have not previously worked together have come together. One really has to go back, I think, to the Six-Day War to see the kind of response. It was different then because there was a long lead up, but nevertheless, the question is, will we look back and say, this, for the current generation, is the parallel to the Six-Day War, which was truly a turning point in American Jewish life in the relationship to Israel. One aspect that I think deserves attention is we are seeing the full impact of the digital revolution. Already we've heard that, scenes from the horrors have appeared everywhere in the world on television. But beyond that, how many of you have been in touch with someone in Israel over the last week? So you see the digital revolution, the Six-Day War, yet to book a telephone call was very expensive. It didn't happen. The fact that American Jews are able to interact in real time with Israel and the ability to see what's going on through social media, through a wide range of news sources, really distinguishes this from what we've seen before. One final point, American Jews are always at their happiest when they are in sync with the policies of the United States government. World War II, being a good American and a good Jew, both led you to the same conclusion: you should fight the Nazis. What is so important about the absolutely unprecedented 2 speeches now that President Biden has delivered is that there is this sense that Jewish policy and American official policy are completely in sync. Nobody is worried that in supporting Israel at this moment, that they are somehow running afoul of the government. Now, those of us who are scholars can appreciate there's a lot going on below the surface. Mr. Blinken is not simply visiting Israel to say good afternoon. They're each has reasons to work together, but it is truly unprecedented, at least in recent decades. And in many ways, the response of the president is completely unprecedented. Much more pressure had to be placed in 1967, in 1973, and even more so in later wars in order to get weapons. As one Israeli pointed out this morning, they gave us the keys to the ammunition before we even asked for it, because a lot is stored there. And that too will be important to watch. Is this a turning point, and does it represent something new and unprecedented? And as I think has been suggested here, are there ways of having these tendencies, having the Jewish community come together, no daylight with the government? Are there ways of preserving that in the difficult weeks to come, or not? Will this be looked back upon as a great turning point? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Sarna. We turn now to the floor. We're going to prioritize questions in the room, but of course, those online are able to submit questions through the Q&A function. I want to make sure that as many of your questions are heard as possible. So if you could please be mindful of the number of people in the room and your voices are very important, but try to be as brief as is reasonably possible. And I'd actually say the same to the panelists as well, so that we can get through as many questions as possible. Okay, and let's start with Professor Feldman. You can address whatever you'd like. Yeah.
So thank you so much for these questions. First of all, I want to thank Alex and really admire him, because he's embarked on something that's almost a mission impossible. To analyze what's just happened when the blood is boiling is a mission impossible, and I completely also agree with Yuval, and in Israel right now, and that's why, and I'll get to that in a second, why it's difficult to conduct this conversation, as Yuval pointed out. Israel is now in a 9/11 mode, and to have a rational, cool, dispassionate discussion in the first few days after 9/11 was very, very difficult, if possible at all. And anger is a very dangerous environment, because as you saw in the case of 9/11, when you make decisions based on anger, it doesn't always lead to the optimal decision. And we Israelis have to be very careful that we don't find ourselves in the same kind of trap. So that's number one. And related to that, I just want to say also one more thing, which is, because the blood is boiling, it's very, very, very difficult for us to try to explain what happened without this being misinterpreted as justifying what happened. Okay, and there is a big, big difference between understanding and justifying. And we kind of will have to pretend in this panel as if we are what I was 50 years ago, was a young intelligence officer. And we didn't have the luxury of letting our personal feelings. We had to provide analysis for decision makers to make the right decisions. Israel suffered, basically, to use a non-academic term, Israel was caught with its pants down. Israel suffered the most basic strategic surprise that it ever since October 1973 suffered. So we've now 50 years. It's after 50 years during which we haven't seen anything resembling what just happened. And what I will say, I want to say one word about that, and one word about the deep predicament in which Israel finds itself in, and to explain why this is such a complicated issue for Israel, aside from what we've just seen in the last few days. The reason Israel was surprised completely is that Israel didn't understand, and that Israel is not the only country that doesn't understand this, and Israeli decision makers are not the only decision makers that don't understand that. What they don't understand is how deterrence works. There is a tendency to think that if you're strong, you deter. That completely ignores the centrality of the issue of motivation. And now I go back to what is very difficult to say these days. The fact of the matter is that Gaza was a gigantic 2.3 million prisoners jail. Okay, and when you're in jail, you will go to great lengths to get out of jail. And there is no question in my mind that most of the Hamas people, again, I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining to you, they crossed the fence with the assumption that they're more likely than not to not survive it, because they had actually an image of Israel as a robust, and the Israeli Defense Forces as capable of everything. So you have we have to understand why is this the case? Why were they not deterred? They weren't deterred because they were highly motivated to get out of jail. And we saw what Israel could do when it was highly motivated against all the odds. The 48, the 56, the 1967, all these so-called miracles were not really miracles. It was simply because the balance of motivation was on Israel's side. Israel perceived then an existential threat. It fought an existential threat. It won. And we saw in 1973 and in 1982 in Lebanon and so on, so what happens when you lose this advantage of having an existential threat? So now Israel is trapped. Why is it trapped? Because it is basic. Hamas does not give Israel any alternative. There are two ways to look at what Hamas is after. One is to look at their ideology. Well, their ideology is crystal clear. They want to destroy Israel. They want to cancel Israel. They want to negate Israel. That's clear. But even if you take the more semi-pragmatic expressions of semi-pragmatic leaders of Hamas, like Yahya Sinwar, how do they define their sort of more appealing to the Western press and Western ears objective? To end the siege. To end the siege. But here's the problem, you see, is that there is a link between the two. If the movement called Hamas, and it is a movement, it's not just a terrorist group, it's a social movement, adheres to its commitment to destroy Israel, Israel cannot afford to end the siege. Right now, they're operationalizing, say, they were asked, well, so what do you mean by that? They said, a port. We want to have a port. Well, if they manage to smuggle as many weapons and create as many rockets and missiles and so on and so forth with the siege in place, can you imagine what Hamas can actually acquire if they had a port to bring through whatever they wanted, whatever they want to? And this is where Hamas completely, I explained a second ago, where Israel completely misunderstood the situation. Now I'll tell you where Hamas completely misunderstands the situation. Israel is not going to cease, okay? And it's not going to cease as long as Hamas doesn't change its ideological commitment. Israel met every condition of Egypt because Egypt made it very clear to Israel that it is interested in peace. Israel even went to great lengths and took many risks in its agreement with Oslo. But Oslo didn't come out of nowhere. Oslo was at a very important phase of a process of pragmatization that the PLO went through beginning in 74, then 1988, and so on and so forth, of making it clear that they accept Israel's existence, and then the negotiations were about what kind of coexistence and so on and so forth. Hamas has not offered Israel anything of the sort. And therefore, this is why we're at a trap, because as long as they adhere to this ideological commitment, Israel actually has no option of ending the siege. And as long as we're not ending the siege, and it's not just us, it's our Egyptian friends as well. We control one border, the Egyptians control another border. They have their own account. They're not entirely endeavored by, or happy with Islamists on their borders. So we are actually co-managing the so-called siege. But Hamas actually is not offering us an option, an alternative, and we're trapped.
Thank you. There were a couple of questions about the role of scholars and the response of American universities to this. I imagine everyone on the panel has a thought about this, but in the interest
It's a different panel.
It's a different panel. Let me ask Professor Bellin to briefly address. Is that?
No, I was going to answer the question. I was asked whether will success of Hamas make it more popular among Palestinians and worldwide? And I have to say, of course, in the short term, the answer is clearly yes, right? Because the success of Hamas in the past few days has satisfied a deep desire for revenge that people feel after years of suffering. But remember, I also said people in Hamas are really eager for good governance, right? 70% of Hamas people say we prefer to have PLA people governing us than Hamas, which is pretty astonishing since the PLA has such a bad history. And I think what we need to realize is we need to be able to harness the centrists in this game. And I think we are facing a certain opportunity. It's hard to say that in this very grim moment, and the next couple of weeks are going to be horrific. But there is an opportunity there, and that is, on one hand, we are on the cusp of a generational shift among Palestinians. Something like half of Gazans are under the age of 18. They had nothing to do with the election of Hamas. They don't even remember Hamas coming to power in 1987 and taking a violent route. The head of the PLA, Mahmoud Abbas, is 87 years old. He is going to die. And there are going to have to be new elections. And that's an opportunity maybe to see a shift in who is leading the Palestinians. And to boost that, as I said before, many great powers in the regional great powers would support moving away from Hamas and seeing a more responsible leadership. Egypt would support it, Saudi would support it, even Qatar would support it. So there is a possibility for some change. My concern is too much violence. If Israel gets bogged down in a Vietnam in Gaza and just continues to kill and kill and kill civilians, which is the inclination of generals, right? Generals, it's like, you know, you've got to, if you have a hammer, you find a nail. Generals think about killing and winning through killing on the battlefield, but that's not how you win politically. And I'm really hopeful that the violence won't persist so long that we will lose the support of some of these other forces in the region and miss this opportunity for generational shift to be able to seize the energy of more centrists in this conflict.
Professor Sarna, there was a couple of questions about the role of scholars and the institutional responses. I want to note that that's definitely the topic of a full lecture that you could probably give, but
I will. That's a nice way of saying, please restrain yourself from talking for half an hour. I remember after 9/11 hearing the similar question posed to the great historian of religion, Martin Marty, and he responded, and it's worth remembering, said, you know, I'm a scholar. That means 10 minutes after anything happens, I can tell you why it was historically inevitable. And in some ways, that's what you are hearing when you have analysis. None of those people a week ago predicted anything of the sort, but that's what scholars do. We tell you why it was historically inevitable. I mean, I don't spend as much time as perhaps some do listening to this pundit and that pundit, but my sense is that you can hear whatever pundit you want, depending on where you turn on your television or on the internet. There's a whole range. They're quite predictable, and their job in many ways is to explain it in a particular fashion. What's so wonderful about what we've been able to do here is you have people actually of quite different politics all coming together. I actually think we are seeing some changes on the academic scene. First of all, we should point out Brandeis is an exception to the generalization that was made. There was a strong statement from the top. The president of Brandeis appeared at the memorial. Many presidential leaders at universities did not. President Leibowitz did, and one could go on. But we're seeing interesting things on universities that we never saw before. Several universities, including our neighbor across the river, put out second statements when they were criticized for their first statement. They said, Oh, that was a mulligan, I think it's called in golf. I'm going to try again. And the second statement was much more powerful. I'm embarrassed to say that was true of the Association for Jewish Studies. Its first statement was appalling, and under pressure from quite a few people, I won't name names, but one of them is on this panel, they put out a much better second statement. And that's worth watching. There are also places, according to the New York Times, that have kind of withdrawn from the statement-making business. And that might be a good thing too. It's not clear to me that the statements have a vast effect. I'm especially interested in terms of the question in the role of some donors. As you may know, at the University of Pennsylvania, there has been a very significant, well-publicized movement on the part of donors. So I think the situation is somewhat in flux, and I think that for some people, seeing the horrors that we have seen on the screen and apparently verified pictures of horrors were released not too long ago by Israel, has tempered older views, and there is much to be learned. Just as when actual news of the Shoah became known, that changed minds. We don't want to be like them. That's not the kind of people, not the kind of country we want. Will that happen now, having seen what we've seen? I don't quite know the answer to that, but I'm inclined, and we will see it, but I'm inclined to think, having studied other moments of change, that there is at least a possibility that it will change. And I would very much encourage you, those of you who are in a position to push for change, to make that happen. Yeah, let's stop. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's take another few questions. Risa. Thank you very much. So we have 11 minutes left on the panel. And I first want to just state the obvious, which is that nobody expected to answer every question today. And the Schusterman Center, and I imagine also the Crown Center, will be providing further resources and events as things continue to unfold. What I'm going to do now is turn first to Professor Saeed Ali to speak briefly about the possibility of this kind of restructuring the international relations within the Arab world and relations to Israel. I'll turn then to Professor Evri to talk about his conversations that he's having with Palestinian friends and his knowledge of Palestinian Israelis and their response to this. And then we'll end by just going down the line, and everybody will have, I don't know, like a minute and a half with my apologies to respond to whatever else that you'd like to. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I'm afraid that we are like the blind who trying to measure a cube of ice while it is melting in his hand. I mean, we are into the situation as we speak now, so it's very difficult. However, the point I want to tell you on the Arab side, you have to distinguish between three things. Number one, there is something called Palestinian people. who is part and parcel of the history of the Arab world, the Islamic world, I mean, for reasons everybody knows as people. But there is something else called the Palestinian cause, which means that there is a case that evolved over the last 100 years and became much more specific since 1948, with all the pains and sorrows that attached to it. And that is treated from the Arab side that peace is possible and peace can be accommodated. And if the Jews have something called Passover, which means they lived in Egypt, or part and parcel of the history of the region in one way or another, then it can be recreated, I will say, in a much more positive ways. And we don't have time to tell you how many positive things happened. The third thing that we have, the current situation, which is part and parcel of our other things. I mean, extremism, Islamist, extremists, 9/11, Afghanistan, the Taliban, Iran revolution. There was a glimpse of a serious geopolitical change for the better in the past few weeks, in which there was the issue of how to bring Saudi Arabia into the camp of peace. However, I think what we are seeing now is a maddening response to that, because that is something geopolitical. Don't forget there is another war parallel to this one in Ukraine. I mean, people are grinding each other with the same things that we are talking about here. So this war is not very unique. Actually, the other war carry with it a possibility of nuclear Armageddon one day or another. So here, that's what is in the Arab world, between these three levels. And we have to come with the Israelis, good ones, Jews, human beings in general, into a kind of settlement that we succeeded in doing it before. It was not easy. It was not easy. There was people, I mean, I didn't want to take too much time, but that's, I think peace is less difficult than war.
Okay, I will maybe go first to the Palestinians in Israel. So, you know, first of all, you have to understand that numbers of Palestinians, Israelis died. There's full families in unrecognized Bedouin village that was killed in Saturdays. There are people that were killed in Ocuin and other places. So there are also some of them under, you know, other rockets attack and so on. So there's, and many others are know people that died or were colleagues with them in the university or in organizations or in other places. So they are all in shock mostly. But they also listen to what the prime minister is saying, what the chief of, you know, the staff, what is the other ministers are saying, that are not calling, they're calling all the people in Gaza as non-human beings, as animals. And they understand that now there's growing sentiment in Israel that all Arabs are not human beings, but definitely all Palestinians, and all Palestinians will be a threat. And they are very much afraid of retaliation in villages inside Israel, of extremists. We already had yesterday one incident in Hawara that 2 Palestinians were killed by settlers as a revenge. And they are really afraid, genuinely afraid of going outside, speaking Arabic, maybe to be looked as suspicious as people that maybe came from Gaza. This is very tense situation. That's why I think it's very important for us as scholars to call out everyone that is not doing this differentiation between people that live in Gaza and not calling all of them non-human beings and animals. This is something that's unbelievably, you know, it's maybe now that even in this time, definitely not prime minister, definitely not the you know, officials in Israel speaking like that. It's not responsible. And this is something that really very, very dangerous, and we need to call out and stop it immediately. This doesn't have any justification to say something like that. Second, I just will say, I mean, only about the failure. I can't say something about failure. I think that it's the biggest question, and Professor Feldman maybe knows much better than me. But I will say that, you know, this fence, they just finished building, like other fences and walls in Israel, billions of dollars, putting into it. As you said, with all the sophistication, we saw that it's not working. I think the thing that we need to rethink now is that that fences and walls won't give us quiet and peace. Only agreement with the Palestinians, not with the Saudis and not with the Qatar and not with the Morocco, only with agreement between the people, because we see that these fences, the most sophisticated ones, doesn't really help.
So I'll take Eva, Jonathan, and then I think Shai will have the last word, and there's just 1 minute each. Thank you.
So I'm just going to respond to the question about mowing the grass. And, the logic behind mowing the grass is that somehow containment, you can contain the threat at very low cost. But I think what we see in the last week and what we will see in the next 2 weeks is that this is a strategy that is not low cost morally and not low cost militarily. And so it's not a viable strategy anymore. That we have to be going more to the core of the problem and solve the problem itself, and not just try to go a path of limited containment.
I'll just comment. Thank you. Just comment on the question about aren't we also seeing kind of media war? And of course, the answer is yes. This is not unique to this war at all. This has been true really since the development of social media. But I don't think it's just two sides fighting. There is also an army of newspapers that endeavor in highly technical ways to give a sense. Did this happen? Is it fake media? Can it be relied upon? Of course, we know that the media company, especially X, formerly known as Twitter, has abandoned any effort to tell us what really happened. But some newspapers are. But I do want to remind you, that's an old story, that we shouldn't believe something till it's verified. And during World War II, the New York Times published relatively little on the Holocaust and nothing about Babi Yar, not one word, because it couldn't be verified. And the JTA, Jewish media, did have it. And many criticized, oh, these are horror stories. We know those are always created in war, which they are. Nevertheless, and this is why history is important, we of course know that all those horror stories actually underestimated the horror, as we found out in 1945. So we won't know exactly what has gone on and how many of the horror stories are correct. It is very important, though, I think, to remember that past experience. The fact that something is unverified does not necessarily make it false.
Thank you. Shai.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to take issue with one thing that was said here by my colleague Jonathan Sarna, so that you at least are left here, leave here with some question marks. Because Jonathan said, nobody saw this, nobody said anything like a week before. You have to have followed the discourse in Israel to understand that the opposite is the case. The opposite is the case. There were significant voices in Israel that were warning that either the idea that somehow the other side will accept the situation is one gigantic illusion, that sooner or later, people who are desperate, as we were desperate in 45, 46, 47, 48, we battled the British Empire. And when it took to get immigrants from Europe who were Holocaust survivors, we found ways on top, through the bottom, and so on and so forth. People who are desperate always find ways. and this was debated in Israel, and the issue also and this was part also of the question of what's the agenda of Israel's defense policy, right? There was a concentration over now the past 10 years, somewhere between 10 and 15 years, to say the only existential threat Israel faces is called Iran. Iran and Iran and Iran and Iran. And people were warning. They say, wait a minute, Iran is very important. But a very good example, former Prime Minister Barak, he once said, not having a border between us and the Palestinians is more dangerous to Israel than a nuclear Iran. It's an existential threat to Israel. Then to say, nobody said, nobody warned, no, a lot of people said, a lot of people warned, a lot of people analyzed. Very, very important voices were there. The problem is that the attention span was somewhere else. And I will end by one thing. This is a post-73 moment in Israel, as far as the gigantic dimensions of this strategic surprise and the colossal impact on my friends and Yuval's friends. And I lived there now for 3 years until a year ago. There is going to be a lot of reckoning in Israel, just like in the post-73 period. And it's not going to end with military intelligence made an intelligence failure. People are going to come to essentially hold the political leaders responsible for what their priorities were, for the fact that they were trying to launch a program in the last 10 months to limit Israel's democracy, and causing essentially they woke up the Israeli center. And who do the Israeli centers consist of? Israeli reservists, okay? And they said, you continue with this, we're not serving. Why? Because the government decided that that's a priority. Now, we can try to paper all this over and say, oh, the American Jewish community is now going to come all together and united because of this and so. No, the opposite is the case. Israel now faces decisions, and it'll have to make the decisions, what its priorities are, and so on and so forth. I'm not getting into politics to say where the decisions should go and so on, but this is, to say, first of all, to say no, nobody said, is just a complete mischaracterization of what happened and misunderstanding of what happened.
Yeah,
and to
I
say,
I spoke about America, not about Israel. Of course, Israeli. And people on the Gaza border said.
and people in America too. Okay.
Who? Shai?
I'll tell you who.
Yeah.
The Israel Policy Forum, sorry, they're not my cup of tea, okay? I have big disagreements with J Street, but you want to tell me that J Street didn't talk about this?
We're at time, but let
We
me,
all love each other.
let me end by saying, firstly, I have deep gratitude to our entire panel. The panelists have also graciously agreed to, yes, and the panelists have graciously agreed to stay behind until 2 o'clock for you all in the room to speak. The formal Zoom meeting will end in 20 seconds. I just need to finish with our wishes and our prayers for wisdom and for understanding and for resilience and for healing and for comfort. Thank you.